Hello, I'm Mary Bones, Director of the Museum of the Big Bend here at Sul Ross State University in Alpine, Texas. How appropriate that the theme for this year's Lea Month is Amistad. As the director of a nonprofit, I am reminded on a daily basis about the power of friendship. I truly believe that anything is possible when you have the right people there to support you. This evening, the museum is honored to have two wonderful folks who embody the true meaning of friendship, Susan Pittman and Don Cadden.
First, I'd like to thank the Tom Lea Institute for the opportunity for the Museum of the Big Bend to be represented in Lea Month. It's a great thing for us. We're excited about its possibilities. Tom Lea and J. Frank Dobie, two 20th century icons of Texas arts and letters. Their influence is still strong today. The Dobie Paisano Fellowship is this state's premier artist-in-residence program. And October 2020 sees the 14th year celebration of Lea Month, with its presentation of topics focused on a theme inspired by Tom Lea. This year's theme, Amistad, friendship. The discussion of these two giants has special relevance for the Museum of the Big Bend, and rightly so, given the role these men have had in its history and in its future development. As a member of the 1936 Texas Centennial Commission, Frank Dobie made sure money was allocated for the construction of the Big Bend Memorial Museum, home of today's Museum of the Big Bend. Now, 80 years later, it's Lea's influence. The museum has kicked off a $10 million capital campaign for a second building that will feature an exhibition of Tom Lea's Western Beef Cattle series. In partnership with the Dallas Museum of Art, its Ray Foster Tom Lea Gallery will provide space for a long-term loan of this magnificent collection. As far as what we're talking about today here, what I'd like to do is address the question, what price glory? 20 years separated the two men's ages, but the relationship they formed became even more than a friendship. Indeed, many have called it a father-son relationship, where they're not simply collaborating on mutual projects, but also exchanging many phone calls, letters, visits with each other, and just ventures out. So how could this intimate bond have been reduced to such acrimony? And what, or more likely who, stepped in to restore it? At issue, the King Ranch, a 2-volume annotated history of that famous cattle operation, the Running W. Its commission to pen was given in 1951 to Tom Lea, when many believed that Frank Dobie, long recognized as the state's premier storyteller and folklorist, should have received it. And it was Dobie's critique upon its publication that no doubt ruptured the friendship. If Dobie had gone looking for it, and I find nothing that indicates he did, he could have brought plenty of cards to the table. He knew the land, the South Texas scrub. He was born on it between the Nueces and the Rio Grande in Live Oak County. He knew the natives of the land, among them the vaqueros. He'd listened to and recorded their stories. He knew the ranch culture, though he'd only worked a ranch one summer when he oversaw his uncle's considerable acreage, Los Alamos, in La Salle County, cutting cattle and roping bull yearlings, he said. His brother was foreman on one of the 4 Running W divisions, and significantly, at the time, he was Texas' best-known man of letters. Mr. Texas, he was called by some. Tom Lea, on the other hand, was all El Paso, an urban kid from a prominent family. His heart always brought him back to the home where he'd been born some 3 years from the banks of the Rio Grande, even when he had numerous more straightforward routes to fame. He was a painter whose novels brought him his first recognition, but who returned to the art world to make his mark. Why Tom Lea, then? to write this history of the most famous ranch in Texas in celebration of its 100th birthday. Some Dobie biographers tend to believe that jealousy wasn't, let me repeat, was not the cause of the breach. Stephen Davis, in A Liberated Mind, contends that Frank would have refused the commission even if offered it. He would not have been willing to subordinate his independence. But Dobie's good friend, Winston Bodie, in the television documentary that later became the biography, A Portrait of Pancho, said Dobie may well have harbored some prejudices from his own growing up on a small ranch not far from the King's spread. Lon Tinkle's biography, an American original, claims that this instance was the only time Dobie ever felt envied toward someone. And Lee himself seems to think that jealousy was the probable cause. Still, what really explains the depth of this unraveling of the bond between the two? A closer look at the personalities of each is in order here. Frank Dobie trucked with none of what he would have called pretense. In a long-running, what I'll call love-hate relationship with the University of Texas, where for a brief time in his early career he taught British Lit, he refused to get the obligatory PhD, calling its average thesis nothing but a transference of bones from one graveyard to another. He had a real aversion to what he called petrified minds. He may well have been thinking of the stringent rules and regulations of the English department at the time he was there. In academia, he was considered what my grandmother would have called rapscallion, hers, not theirs, an endearing term. But make no mistake, he loved teaching, sharing the stories he had learned in conversation with the people of the land. Obtaining a master's degree from Columbia, he was invited and taught one term at Cambridge during World War II. He bragged about how he had lugged Sam Houston into the curriculum. Dobie also had outspoken views on what he saw as braggart Texans. Here are several comments from Some Part of Myself, a series of essays compiled by his wife Bertha after his death. Regarding popular cinema, he said, "I came to avoid pictures portraying to be of ranch life and work as betrayals of that life." And later, "In Texas, the word ranch has not yet been corrupted, as in California, to mean chicken roost, potato patch, and all other plots of ground larger than a town lot. Also, not all ranchers are cattle kings." Maybe a hint of things to come. He wanted his writing, as he said, to capture the flavor, the metaphor, and the very genius of the people who rode Mustangs, traded Longhorns, stuck Spanish daggers, that is to say yucca spines, into their flesh to cure rattlesnake bites. His books, Coronado's Children, Apache Gold and Yaqui Silver, The Longhorns, and others did just that, making obvious that the people and places of South Texas were firmly in his DNA. And sure enough, these accounts led to his receiving national acclaim and recognition as Texas' first important author. Dobie met Tom Lee through the younger man's father. In 1937, he was invited to give a lecture in El Paso and was invited by Mayor Lee to spend the evening in their home. Dobie struck up an immediate friendship with son Tom. The day after they met, Lee drew in 2¼ hours in his studio his first portrait of Dobie. The 1953 portrait he painted in Chinese ink, though, is the familiar one, the one we recognize, and Dobie said it was the very best likeness of him ever done. But it was that early one that led to Frank's asking Tom to illustrate his nonfiction Western, Apache Gold and Yaqui Silver. Lea had begun his artistic career and no doubt thought of himself as a muralist. He was even doing this while still a student at the Art Institute in Chicago. The murals we're most familiar with are found in post offices. Odessa, before its post office was remodeled, held the Stampede, which has now been relocated to the Ellen Noel Art Museum there in Odessa. Or in federal buildings, Pass of the North, which is recognized as his best, is at El Paso's U.S. Courthouse, and his best one rightly should be in El Paso. Or if you visited the State Fair of Texas and gone to the Hall of State, you may be familiar with the ones that Tom Lea painted there in the West Texas room for the Texas Centennial in 1936. But when Dobie asked him to illustrate his books, Lea found the transition to pen and ink came to him naturally. With the onset of World War II, Tom Lea's life took on a different direction when Life magazine hired him as an accredited war correspondent. The 5 years he was engaged in that job took him to several active theaters of war. At the war's conclusion, Life presented to the government some 200 paintings done by its 9 war artists. The greatest number were by Tom Lea. What Lea wrote to Dobie, assessing his role, will take on special meaning in light of Dobie's disappointment and critique of the King Ranch. And Lea said, "I want to make it clear that I did not report hearsay. I did not imagine or fake or improvise. I did not cuddle up with personal emotion. I reported in pictures what I saw with my eyes wide open." And what more evidence do we need than the 2,000-yard stare, painted after the artist returned to the ship from having gone ashore with the Marines at bloody Peleliu, armed with nothing more than a pencil and notepad. As mentioned, Tom Lea had gained early fame with his novels, The Brave Bull and then The Wonderful Country, both made into movies. Significantly here, both elicited high praise from Dobie for their economy and clean-limbed saliency, the clarity of their purpose and execution. That was strong endorsement from a brutally honest critic of writing, a 25-year newspaper columnist who minced no words. Regarding Lea, Tom claimed that his spiritual son, called spiritual son here because wife Bertha had had the Spanish flu in that epidemic in 1918 and had had several recurring bouts of the flu such that she was unable to get pregnant. So for Dobie, this was his spiritual son, and he said about him that he would soon be recognized as the most original and the most potent creator, without exception, that the expanses of Texas can claim. It was as though he was already passing the torch that he had owned for such a long time, and proudly so. But it was Lea's earlier work for Life magazine that set the stage for the personal crisis to come. With the war finally over, Life wanted more of Tom's talents. Editor Daniel Longwell gave him another assignment, a painted history of the Western beef cattle industry. Of note here is that it's this body of work, Western Beef Cattle, a series of 11 paintings, that is the collection the Museum of the Big Bend hopes to display in its new wing, and essentially is the primary reason for the building campaign. Just as an aside to this, Life donated this series to what is today the Dallas Museum of Art. It was exhibited at the museum from October 7th, 1950 until January 4th, 1951 to celebrate that year's State Fair of Texas. Subsequently, it's been in storage. The importance to our story, however, is the impact that Lea's cattle paintings and his novel, The Brave Bulls, made on Helen Campbell Clayburgh, wife of impresario Bob. She liked his realistic drawing of cattle. Lea and Dobie had come to the King Ranch earlier to see its Longhorn operation. Nothing more. No interaction with the family. But a bit later, as Tom was working on The Wonderful Country, Kleberg agents contacted him by mail and offered him the commission to write the history of the Running W, the so-called walled kingdom, with full access to the tightly guarded family archives. It may have surprised him. He said later that he believed that Dobie didn't get the job because he was too liberal. I didn't ever know the reason. I did know that the Klebergs were very much against Frank. I'm not sure what the origin of the trouble was, except for Frank's great liberal politics. So that's why I think, and not Frank, got the job. In Texas Monthly's 2002 December cover story, Don Graham said, Dobie would have wrestled a rattlesnake barehanded to get into that vault. And as far as what Dobie himself thought a liberal was, he said that a liberal was simply a man willing to see the truth and unwilling to reject what is real. Lea agreed to accept the commission only if he could have friend Holland McCombs help him with the research. McCombs actually was the one who introduced Helen Kleberg to the Brave Bulls. Lea also insisted that longtime friend Carl Herzog design and print the compilation. And all of this was before Tom even met Bob Kleberg. Well, it was supposed to be a brief interlude to write a little monograph, something initially encouraged by Dobie. But the research and composition went on year after year as the Klebergs ostensibly wined and dined Lea and plied him with their own version of the story. Dobie began to worry that Lea couldn't retain his independence, his free mind, the notion that the best writing had to come out of one's own self. He worried about what Lon Tinkle called emotionally identifying with the mystique of empire, of power. Feeling that Tom Lea was giving up too much of his life, 5 years, to the King Ranch, Frank wrote him a letter to make friendly suggestions that there would be strings attached. And sure enough, the King Ranch retained the copyright and control of what was said. In Lea's defense, he was accustomed as a painter who worked by commissions to pleasing his patrons. Dobie, on the other hand, was always fiercely independent. Nobody should review a book by a dear friend, he wrote Tom when he was asked by the New York Times to review it, but I'll write you after I've read the work, and then you can compare what I say with what comes out in print. The account itself was originally meant only for private distribution, but the King Ranch sensed its commercial possibilities and sold the rights to Little Brown and Company in Boston, which, by the way, was Dobie's publisher too. Publication itself arrived with great fanfare. 20,000 copies were printed initially and immediately sold out with a call for more. On September 14th, 1957, El Paso was to celebrate its now favorite son with a Tom Lea Day. Of course, Frank and wife Bertha were invited and did come. Dobie even spoke that night at the celebratory dinner, but he didn't mention a word about the book. Earlier, after reading the history, he had written Tom the promised response. It was a rather severe private analysis, but he concluded it with, "If I didn't love you so much, and you know it, I never would have done something that's so savage." The timing of the front page critique in the New York Times may have been the killer here. It came out the next day, and while more cautious, was to Lea and friends a betrayal. In it, Dobie challenged the work's claim that the King Ranch was the birthplace of the ranching industry. He noted that Spanish-Mexican cattle had been around before King owned an acre or a cow. Also, over the years, Dobie had become an outspoken humanitarian regarding social justice and called into question the happy relationship between the owners and the vaqueros, suggesting that certain facts were omitted, that the rhapsodic treatment smacked of old Black Joe days, too much sentimental praise and family album minutia, he wrote. Lee's view of his assessment of the ranch looks much different. In his oral history, he speaks of the relationship with the Clayburghs as immediate friendship, trust on both sides. You know, you can tell, he says. I stayed a hired man, but it became a kind of friendship. So you can imagine Lee's shock. His anger at Dobie's remarks was directed at what he called the kind of criticism he hated most, a failure of integrity. And it was his good friend who said it. It just made me GD mad that Frank had been here yesterday knowing that he had written it and that it had been printed. At the same time, Dobie's attendance at the Tom Lee event and even his correspondence thereafter suggested that he didn't realize the damage done. He didn't realize how much he'd wounded his friend. His and Bertha's return to Austin found him suffering from what turned out to be pneumonia with coronary complications. When he finally went to the hospital, he was near death. Recovery there took 6 weeks and occasioned many well-wishers and many cards expressing hope. Tom Lee was not among them at all. Ouch. At this point, let's look at their 2 women, Sarah Lee and Bertha Dobie, who, most agree, were the means to the reconciliation in the men's relationship. Bertha was a Pennsylvania-born girl whose family already had a Texas residence. She grew up in several small towns and upon graduation from high school, enrolled at Southwestern in Georgetown. She and Frank undoubtedly shared several classes, as both were liberal arts students pursuing degrees in literature. They met in a yearbook class, but didn't, or rather couldn't, date until they were seniors, when the school rules changed to allow senior girls to date. She knew that he was dating another girl at the same time they were dating. Independent herself, she let her commitment to the relationship be based on whoever he asked to the senior banquet. It was she. But the campus was stricken by an epidemic of mumps. He contracted it and spent that night in the infirmary. Nonetheless, they became a couple. They graduated, both became teachers. That was the beginning of a 6-year exchange of letters and finally marriage. She received a master's degree at University of Texas during his engagement teaching there. Dobie credited her with being his best editor and critic. She was at one time the assistant editor of Texas Folklore Society publications. She conducted his classes for him when he was away gathering material for his books. She was a writer herself, primarily magazine articles on gardening, her passion, and was a guest lecturer on the subject throughout the state. The nearly 50-year marriage she shared with Frank and her influence on his personal and professional life is unquestionable. Same thing can be said of Sarah and her role in Tom's life. He had lost his first wife to a botched appendectomy and returned from their home in Santa Fe to El Paso to regroup. Tom said he was sort of floating around when he met Sarah at a dinner party some 2 years after wife Nancy's death. He was the arranged date, but for both it was an immediate attraction. She was a divorcee with a young son whom Tom adopted upon their marriage. According to Adair Margot, When her mother asked her how she would live on an artist's meager income, she replied, "Watch me." In a 1992 address at the opening of the De Goyer Library at SMU, Tom said, "She has not only been an intrepid comrade, but a wise and steadying companion in all endeavors. And besides that, my girl and beautiful." Steadying may be the key word here. Upon his return from the 5 years he spent covering World War II, it was working on a portrait of her, Sarah in the summertime, that he credits with helping him exorcise the horrors he had witnessed. A potential Citizen of the Year model in her own right, she found greatest satisfaction in assisting Tom in his career. Following Lea's initial vocal outrage toward Dobie, there was, in his words, a dropping off of my friendship with Frank for about 3 years after. For some 6 months, there was no communication at all. The message was clear. Finally, the wives decided to act. Sarah, in Austin for other business, went by to see the Dobies. This was in June 1958. She had told Tom she was going because she thought it was terrible that they were so far apart. The visit was more than well received. Dobie was very, very happy, as was Bertha, who said that Frank had really suffered. The three parted as friends. Frank immediately wrote to Tom. In it was the apology, "I never did intend to question your integrity." At some point, Tom did send a letter to which Frank responded. "Having a letter from you was just like old times." Finally, in Austin to deliver a painting, Tom went by to see him. He later recalled that Dobie gave him a big hug and that the two men decided to let bygones be bygones. Shortly thereafter, some 3 or 4 months, Frank Dobie died. Lon Tinkle claimed that Tom Lee was stricken most because he felt challenged about his fidelity to truth. But for Frank Dobie, the rupture was tantamount to losing a son. According to Stephen Davis, the two men did exchange a few letters subsequently, but the relationship was never the same. The truth, according to Tinkle, was that the damage was irreparable. But when Frank died in 1964, Bertha asked Tom to be a pallbearer. And Tom? Well, he said later, "We had patched things up." I hope that is the truth.
Mary asked me to talk also about the kind of the connection of cowboy music and Mexican corridos. They're very similar. They all come from the same place. They're stories about happenings, basically. The corridos really came to their highlight during the Mexican Revolution because there were so many things that were happening, battles every day, and people, it was a war all over Mexico. And so all these different events came to be told in these corridos. It's very similar with cowboy music. Of course, guitars were way too big to carry during the trail drive days. So what happened a lot of times was an event would happen. Somebody would get bucked off, or somebody would get fall in love. I mean, something would happen, and somebody would make a story up about it, and that story would become a poem because it's much easier to remember something that rhymes. So the cowboy poems started coming about, and almost all of the old traditional songs that we hear now that are the old traditional cowboy songs originally were poems. So you can really do them either way. I had a ranch lease for about 37 years near Cotulla, and there was an old vaquero that came out to that ranch, and he was a wonderful guy, and he would tell us stories about all the cattle he'd roped and all the wild things he'd done. So I wrote a song about him, and I'd like to do it for you. So I wrote a song about Ernesto Galvan. Knew him, I guess, till he passed away. I knew him for about 30 years. Heck of a cowboy, a heck of a vaquero. Down south of old San Antone is a country that God left alone, where the cactus has thorns and the deer grow big horns. Weather is usually warm, where the coyote howls and the panther he prowls. Rattlesnake grows 6 feet long. People who live there have always had their share of working themselves to the bone. When the sun comes up for the day, he's out saddling up his old bay. He'll ride the mesquite in the terrible heat, as his father did the same way. He'll rope and he'll brand, it's the law of the land. Cows think they're his, but they're not. He's just earning a buck, 'cause in a new pickup truck, El Jefe sees over a lot. Ernesto, Ernesto Galvan, truly a man of the land. You've chased mucha vaca with Cayo and Riata. You're a muy bueno cowhand. Sat by the campfire many nights, away from the noise and the lights, with tortillas and beans and fried javelin. Told stories to his friends' great delight, of chasing wild boars, of border town whores, of things most men never see. Like a prickly pear bloom, a calf fresh from the womb, creatures that run wild and free. He's seen a lot in his life, had good times and bad with his wife. Well, he's raised 6 sons, and they're mostly good ones, hardly ever fight with a knife. His chaps, they're worn in his old saddle horn, ridden miles with Ernesto Galvan. The years how they fly, time's passed you by, you're still one hell of a man. Ernesto, Ernesto Galvan, you're truly a man of the land. You've chased mucha vaca, caballo and riata, muy bueno cowhand. Still rides with his dogs by his side, remembering the past with great pride. Didn't make much dinero for a macho vaquero, but from his loot the steers could not hide. When it's time to turn in, and God says, my friend, we're fixing to change your luck. 'Cause in heaven, take my word, El Jefe rides herd, you get the new pickup truck. Ernesto, Ernesto Galvan, you're truly a man of the land. You've chased mucha vaca with Cayo and Riata, muy bueno cowhand. Yeah, you chased mucha vaca with Cayo and Riata, muy bueno cowhand. When Dobie was writing The Longhorns and Lea was illustrating it, they went on a grand adventure around South Texas to a lot of the old ranches down there to talk to people about Longhorns and get the stories about the Longhorns. The Longhorns were dying breed at that point. They were saved a little later, brought back, but there were still some of them around. One of the great stories I love, and it's in I'll Tell You a Tale, is a story of Sancho, the steer that they took him up the trail, I don't remember how many times, but he led the herds up the trail, and then they'd bring him back to Texas, and he had a life of leisure until he had to go up the trail again. So when they were at those ranches, I'm sure they spent some nights around a campfire and heard songs and poems that were popular in that day or that the cowboys were singing. One of those songs, at that time, it was a poem that originally written in the very early 1900s. And so they may have heard it as a song or they may have heard it as a poem. The theme of it is one that we see through cowboy music and even some country music, is the gringo falling in love with the beautiful Mexican girl. It goes all the way through Marty Robbins' El Paso. And in cowboy music, there's all sorts of songs and poems about that, and I'm sure it was something that happened a lot. But this song, the actual name of it is Mi Amor, Mi Corazón, which means my love, my heart. And it's a neat old song, and I would hope they got to hear it. Spanish is a loving tongue, soft as music, light as spray. Was a girl I learned it from, living down Sonora way. I don't look much like a lover, yet I say her love words over. Often when I'm all alone, mi amor, mi corazón. Nights when she knew where I'd ride, she would listen for my spurs, fling that big door open wide, raise them laughing eyes of hers. And my heart would nigh stop beating when I'd hear her tender greeting, whispered soft for me alone, mi amor, mi corazón. Moonlight on the patio, old senora nodding near, me and Juana talking low, so's the madre wouldn't hear. How those hours would go a-flying, and too soon I'd hear her sighing in her little sorry tone, adios mi corazón. Then one night I had to fly for a foolish gambling fight, and we said a swift goodbye on that black unlucky night. When I'd loosed her arms from clinging, with her words of woes were ringing, as I galloped north alone, adios mi corazón. Haven't seen her since that night, I can't cross that line, you know. She was Mex and I was white, like as not it's better so. But I've always sort of missed her since that last wild night I kissed her, broke her heart and left my home, adios mi corazón. Broke her heart and left my home, adios mi corazón.